The fleet held position above the dying world, and Una stood at the center of the command bridge, surrounded by screens that showed the silence spreading across Malova like a stain below them. 5 billion Molovans stood frozen in the streets of their cities, their eyes open, their mouths fixed in silent screams, their consciousness trapped in an eternal moment of consumption. The silence had not killed them. It had done something far worse. "The broadcast systems are ready," announced Admiral Chun. "Every human ship in the fleet is linked to the network, and relay stations are transmitting to colonies across 3 sectors. How many humans will receive the message?" Una asked. "Approximately 4 billion, Chun replied. "Every human being within range of our communications." Una closed her eyes and thought about what she was asking. She was asking 4 billion people to hope, to dream, to imagine futures that might never exist, to believe in victory despite all evidence suggesting defeat. She was asking them to be human. "Send the message," she said. The transmission went out across the stars, carrying words that Una had written in the quiet hours before dawn. "This is Dr. Una Seong, calling all humans within range of this broadcast. Our ancestors were chosen 3 billion years ago because they possessed something unique, something precious, something that the beings who created the galaxy believed could save the universe. They called us the Dreamers. Today I'm asking you to dream. I am asking you to close your eyes and imagine a future where we survive, where we protect our friends and families, where we prove that hope is stronger than hunger. I am asking you to believe in something impossible, because impossible things are what humans do best." The silence responded immediately, its million voices rising in something that sounded almost like laughter. "Your hope is meaningless," it announced. "We have consumed dreamers before. We have tasted your impossible futures and found them sweet. You cannot defeat us with wishes." Una opened a channel to the Keeper, who waited in the lightless rift with ancient systems primed and ready. "Are you prepared?" she asked. "I have been prepared for 3 billion years," the Keeper replied. "But I need time to activate the protocols. Time that we may not have." "You will have it," Una promised. She turned to face the darkness that hung over Malova, and she raised her voice so that every human on every ship could hear her. "Think of someone you love," she called out. "Think of something you want to accomplish, something you want to see, something you want to become. Think of children not yet born and stories not yet told. Think of discoveries waiting to be made and worlds waiting to be explored. Think of everything that could be, everything that might be, everything that will be if we survive this day. And believe. Believe with everything you have. Believe until believing is all that exists." The response came like a wave, like a sunrise, like a billion candles lighting at once in the darkness across the fleet. Humans closed their eyes and dreamed. They dreamed of peace and of adventure, of love found and love lost, and love waiting to be discovered. They dreamed of their children growing tall and their parents finding rest, of enemies becoming friends and strangers becoming family. They dreamed of futures that made no sense and futures that made perfect sense and futures that changed with every heartbeat. And the dreams poured into the broadcast network like water through a broken dam, carrying hope and frequencies that the universe had not heard since the architects fell. The silence screamed. It was not a sound that ears could hear, but Una felt it in her bones, in her blood, in the deepest parts of her mind where instinct lived. The hunger that had consumed worlds recoiled from something it could not process, something that refused to follow rules, something that created new patterns faster than it could absorb them. "The protocols are activating," the Keeper announced, her voice carrying across the quantum link. "But I need more time." "The silence is fighting back. Give her everything," Una ordered. And she joined her own dreams to the broadcast. She thought of her grandmother, who had died believing that the old stories held truth. She thought of the Keeper, who had waited 3 billion years for children she had never met. She thought of Vareth Kol, who had learned that his species was younger than the creatures he had dismissed as infants. She thought of every alien who had ever looked at humans and wondered what made them so strange, so stubborn, so impossible to predict, and she hoped for them. She hoped that the Velareth would find peace with their new understanding of history. She hoped that the Cathari would overcome their skepticism and embrace the impossible. She hoped that the Malavans would be freed from their frozen prison. She hoped for species she had never met and worlds she would never see. And the silence could not process a single thought she had. "It is working," the Keeper called out, her voice filled with wonder. "The old systems are coming online. The prison protocols are engaging." The darkness above Malova began to fragment. Pieces of the silence tearing away like shadows fleeing from light. The million voices that had spoken in unison dissolved into chaos. Each absorbed consciousness, suddenly aware of something it had never experienced in all the eons of its imprisonment. Possibility, hope, dreams. "You cannot do this," the silence screamed. But its voice was breaking apart. "We are eternal. We are infinite. We are the end of all thought." "You are wrong," Una replied, and her voice carried across every frequency the broadcast could reach. "You are the end of ordered thought, the end of predictable patterns, the end of minds that follow rules." But human minds do not follow rules. We dream of impossible things, and impossible things become real when enough people believe in them. The Keeper activated the final protocol, and space itself seemed to fold around the silence, trapping it in layers of reality that had been designed 3 billion years ago for exactly this purpose. The darkness compressed, shrunk, collapsed into something that could be contained, and then it was gone. The stars returned to the sky above Malova, and across the frozen planet, 5 billion Malavans drew their first free breaths in days. They would need time to recover, time to process what had happened to them, time to understand how close they had come to eternal imprisonment. But they were alive, they were free, and they would remember who had saved them. Una stood on the bridge of the flagship as the fleet began rescue operations, and she allowed herself a moment of quiet wonder. They had done it. 4 billion human beings had dreamed at once, and their dreams had pushed back an entity that had destroyed the architects themselves. "Dr. Sion," Admiral Chun said softly, "the Coalition Assembly is requesting your presence. They want to discuss humanity's new role in galactic affairs." Una thought of the Keeper, who would continue her watch in the Lightless rift. She thought of the other rifts scattered across the universe, each one containing a piece of the silence, each one guarded by a human who had waited billions of years for this moment. She thought of the responsibilities that came with being the Dreamers, the weight of a legacy that stretched back to the first humans who had looked at the stars and wondered. "Tell them I will be there," she said. "But first I need to make a promise." She opened a channel to the silence, to the compressed fragment that now slept in its restored prison. "We will find a way to free your victims," she said. "Every consciousness you have consumed, every mind you have trapped, every soul you have held frozen in eternal awareness. It may take centuries, it may take millennia, but humans do not give up on impossible things. We dream them into reality, and one day, we will dream your prisoners free." The silence did not respond, but Una felt something shift in the darkness, something that might have been fear or might have been hope. 3 months later, she stood before the reformed Galactic Coalition as humanity's first ambassador to the Keepers, and she looked out at representatives of species who now saw humans with new eyes. The Velareth had returned. Humbled and grateful, the Cathari had abandoned their skepticism. the Malavans had declared humans to be honorary warriors, the highest honor their culture could bestow, and in the Lightless rift, the Keeper watched over a universe that her children had saved. "We are not finished," Yuna told the assembly. "The silence is contained, but it is not destroyed. And other threats wait in the darkness between galaxies. But we have proven something today. We have proven that hope is not weakness. We have proven that dreams are not delusions. We have proven that the youngest species in the Coalition carries a spark that has been burning since before the first stars were born. We are the dreamers," she declared, "and we will never stop imagining better futures." In the silence that followed, she heard something that sounded like the beginning of a new age, applause, and somewhere in the void, where light had never reached and stars had never formed, an ancient voice whispered its gratitude to the children, who had finally found their way home. The human voice had responded first, and the universe would never be the same. The message from the silence spread across the galaxy like a plague, and civilization trembled in its wake. Yuna stood before the Coalition Assembly 3 days after escaping the Lightless rift, and she watched the representatives of 100 species struggle to process what she had told them. The Valorith delegation had withdrawn to the far corner of the chamber, their scales displaying colors of grief and shame, their 3 million years of assumed superiority crumbling around them. The Cathari argued among themselves in clicking languages that the translator systems could barely process, debating whether the threat was real or an elaborate human deception. The Malavans sat in grim silence, their warrior culture already calculating the odds of fighting something that had destroyed the beings who created the galaxy, and they, humans, the human representatives, listened with expressions that ranged from disbelief to wonder to terrible determination. And Yuna saw in their eyes the same spark the Keeper had described, the capacity to hope, even when hope made no sense. "We have confirmation," announced Admiral Chun, the highest-ranking human officer in the Coalition fleet. The Malavan homeworld received a transmission 6 hours ago, identical to the one that reached the rift. "The silence is not making empty threats," she continued. "It knows where our worlds are, and it is coming." The assembly erupted into chaos, species shouting accusations and demands and prayers in languages that blended into a wall of noise. Yuna closed her eyes and thought of the Keeper, who had remained in the rift to guard against further intrusions, who had watched her children leave with tears streaming down her ancient face. She thought of her grandmother, who had died believing that the old stories contained truth that modern people had forgotten. She thought of every human who had ever looked at the stars and wondered if something was looking back. Then she stepped forward and raised her voice. "Above the chaos, I know you are afraid," she said. And the assembly gradually fell silent. "I'm afraid too. More afraid than I have ever been in my life. But fear will not save us." She looked around the chamber, meeting eyes of every color and shape, facing species that had dismissed humanity as children and newcomers and accidents of evolution. "The architects chose humans for a reason," she continued. "Not because we were special in the ways you measure worth. Not because we were powerful or advanced or wise. They chose us because we dream, because we imagine futures that do not exist, because we hope when there is no rational basis for hope, because we refuse to accept that the universe is fixed and unchanging. That is our gift to the galaxy," she said. "The capacity to believe in possibilities that have never been proven. And that is what will save us from the silence." The Valorith senior historian stepped forward, her ancient eyes filled with something that might have been respect. "What would you have us do, Dr. Siong?" she asked. "Our fleets are powerful, but the Keeper herself said that military force cannot defeat this enemy." "I would have you stand with us," Yuna replied. "Not because you believe we can win, but because standing together is better than falling alone. I would have you remembered that the architects did not create the coalition. She continued. They created the seeds from which all of us grew, and they hoped that one day their children would find common ground. This is that day. This is the moment when we discover whether the galaxy's civilizations can work together, or whether we will face extinction, divided and alone. The assembly voted 3 hours later, and for the first time in coalition history, the decision was unanimous. Every species would contribute to the defense of the Malovan homeworld, where the Silence had announced its intention to feed. Una spent the following days working with coalition scientists and the Keeper, who communicated through quantum-entangled systems that the architects had built into her vessel. They learned that the Silence was not a single entity, but a vast network of absorbed consciousnesses. Billions of minds trapped in eternal awareness, used as processing nodes for something that should never have existed. They learned that the fragment approaching Malova was small compared to the whole. A tendril sent to test the defenses of the younger races, and they learned that no weapon in the coalition arsenal could harm something that existed in the spaces between thoughts. Then we will find another way, Una said when the final reports came in. Humans have always found ways to solve problems that seemed impossible. She gathered a team of human researchers, specialists in neurology and psychology, and the strange science of consciousness itself. They worked without sleep, driven by the knowledge that billions of lives depended on their success. And on the seventh day, Una made a discovery that changed everything. The Silence feeds on ordered patterns. She explained to the gathered admirals and scientists. It processes consciousness the way a computer processes data, absorbing thoughts into its network and using them to grow stronger. But human consciousness does not follow ordered patterns. She displayed the neural scans they had taken, comparing human brain activity to the brain activity of every other coalition species. Every other species thinks in sequences, she said. Input leads to processing, leads to output, cause leads to effect, leads to conclusion. Humans think in spirals. Our thoughts branch and loop and contradict themselves. We hold multiple possibilities in our minds simultaneously. We believe things without evidence and doubt things despite proof. To the Silence, our minds look like static, and static disrupts signals. Admiral Chun leaned forward, her eyes bright with understanding. You are suggesting we use human consciousness as a weapon, she said. Broadcast our thoughts at the Silence and hope they interfere with its ability to function. Not our thoughts, Una replied. Our dreams, our hopes, our irrational beliefs in futures that may never exist. The Silence cannot process possibility, she explained. It can only consume what already is, what has already been thought. What follows predictable rules, but hope is not predictable. Hope creates new patterns with every moment, imagines new futures with every heartbeat. If we can broadcast enough human hope at the Silence, we might be able to disrupt it long enough for the Keeper to activate the old architect protocols. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. You want to ask every human in the galaxy to hope at the same time, said the Valorith Admiral. To deliberately imagine futures in order to confuse an entity that has consumed civilizations. Yes, Una said simply. I want to show the Silence what it means to face the Dreamers. The fleet arrived at Malova 3 days later, and the sight that greeted them stripped away the last vestiges of comfort. The planet hung in space like a wounded thing. Its cities dark, its communication networks silent, its atmosphere thick with something that sensors could not identify, and above it, blocking out the stars, floated the Silence. It had no form, no shape, no visible structure, but Una could feel it pressing against her mind. A presence so vast and so hungry that her thoughts stuttered whenever she looked directly at it. The transmission came immediately. Millions of voices speaking in perfect unison. "You have come to us," the silence said. And the words carried echoes of joy and hunger and endless patience. "We have waited so long to taste the dreamer minds again. The last ones fought so beautifully before they fell." Una looked at the darkness that had swallowed a world, and she felt fear trying to overwhelm her. But she also felt something else. She felt hope, not because victory was assured, not because the odds were in their favor, not because logic suggested they could win. She felt hope because hope was what humans did. She felt hope because her grandmother had taught her that the old stories held truth. She felt hope because somewhere in her blood, a spark that had been kindled 3 billion years ago refused to go out. "Prepare the broadcast," she ordered, "and contact every human ship, every human colony, every human being in range of our communications. Tell them what we need. Tell them to dream." The keeper led them deeper into the ancient vessel, and with every step, Una felt the weight of 3 billion years pressing against her understanding of reality. The corridors responded to her presence, like a loyal pet greeting its owner, walls glowing brighter when she approached and dimming when she passed. And she realized that the ship recognized her on some level that went beyond simple biology. "The architects designed us to be compatible," the keeper explained, watching Una's wonder with something like motherly pride. "Your neural patterns are descended from the original templates they created when they elevated the first humans. And this vessel was built to respond to those patterns." Vareth Cole walked beside them in rigid silence, his scales cycling through colors that indicated deep distress. And the 2 Valorith historians behind him had stopped recording entirely. Their civilization had built its identity on being the eldest and wisest of the coalition races. And that identity was crumbling with every word the keeper spoke. "Tell us about the architects," Una said. "Who were they? And what happened to them?" The keeper paused before a door that opened into a chamber filled with light, and when they entered, Una found herself standing in what could only be described as a memory. Images surrounded them on every surface. Moving pictures that told a story older than the galaxy itself. "The architects were the first," the keeper began. "They emerged when the universe was young, when stars were rare and precious things, when the cosmic darkness held more mysteries than any species could hope to solve. They were not one species but many. A coalition of early civilizations that found each other across the vast emptiness and chose cooperation over conquest." The images show beings of incredible diversity, creatures of light and shadow and forms that human minds could barely process, working together to build structures that spanned solar systems. They discovered that life was rare and precious. The keeper continued, "And they made it their purpose to ensure that life would spread across the cosmos, that no corner of the universe would remain empty forever. For billions of years, they seeded worlds with the building blocks of biology, and they watched as their children took their first steps toward consciousness." Una watched primitive humans appear in the images, small and fragile creatures huddled around fires on a world that was barely recognizable as Earth. But of all their children, humans were special, the keeper said, and her voice carried both love and sorrow. "Your ancestors possessed something the architects had never seen before, the capacity to dream." Morthven stepped forward. Her 4 arms crossed in the Cathari gesture of skepticism. "Many species dream," she objected. "It is a common neurological function. You dream of things that exist," the keeper replied. "Humans dream of things that do not exist yet, things that may never exist, things that violate the laws of physics and logic and probability. Humans do not merely process information while they sleep. They create new information, new possibilities, new futures that have never been considered by any mind in the universe. The architects called this the dreamer trait, and they believed it was the key to transcendence." The images shifted, showing the architects gathering around the early humans. studying them with reverence that seemed almost religious. They elevated some of your ancestors to serve as keepers, the keeper explained. Guardians who would watch over the galaxy until humanity evolved enough to claim its inheritance. But they also began a great project, she continued. And her voice grew heavy with grief. A network designed to link all consciousness across the universe. To share thoughts and memories and dreams among every living thing. They believed this network would elevate them further, would allow them to achieve a state of being beyond physical existence. They were wrong. The images turned dark, showing something that hurt to look at directly. A presence that existed in the spaces between thoughts. A hunger that had no form but somehow filled every corner of the display. Something else found the network, the keeper said. Something that had been sleeping in the void since before the first stars ignited. Something that fed on consciousness the way fire feeds on wood. The architects called it the silence. Because where it spread, all thought ceased. It did not kill its victims, she explained. Death would have been merciful compared to what the silence offered. It consumed them, absorbed their consciousness into itself, and held them frozen in eternal awareness. Imagine being unable to move, unable to speak, unable to think a new thought, but perfectly conscious of your imprisonment. That is what the silence does to every mind it touches. Thresh. The Malavan security officer made a sound of deep horror, and her massive form seemed to shrink as the implications became clear. The architects sacrificed themselves to stop it. The keeper continued. They used everything they had learned in billions of years of existence to force the silence back into dormancy, but they could not destroy it. They could only create barriers. Prisons of folded space where fragments of the silence would sleep until something disturbed them. The rifts. Yuna breathed, understanding flooding through her. Yes, the keeper confirmed. The lightless rifts scattered across the universe are not natural formations. They are cages, each one containing a piece of the silence, and each one contains a keeper, placed there to warn the younger races if the cages ever opened. She looked at Yuna with eyes that held both hope and terrible fear. 3 of my siblings have gone silent in the past 1,000 years, she said. Their rifts were opened, not by curious explorers seeking knowledge, but by something deliberately searching for the prison gates. The silence is waking, and it has learned patience. It is using the keeper's own communication frequencies to locate the remaining rifts. And when it has found them all, it will rise again. Vareth Cole finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Why tell us this? He asked. What can the coalition possibly do against a threat that destroyed the architects themselves? The keeper smiled, and her smile held something that Yuna recognized immediately. Hope. The architects could not defeat the silence because their minds worked in patterns. She explained. Logical, ordered, predictable patterns that the silence could anticipate and consume. But human minds are different. You dream of impossible things, she said, looking directly at Yuna. You believe in futures that have no evidence to support them. You hope when hope is irrational. You create new patterns that have never existed before. The silence cannot process chaos, she continued. It cannot anticipate what does not follow rules. It cannot consume what constantly reinvents itself. Human consciousness is noise to the silence, static, interference that disrupts its ability to function. That is why the architects chose you, she said. Not because you were the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced. Because you were the most unpredictable. Because you dream. Yuna felt the weight of 3 billion years of expectation settling onto her shoulders. And she understood why her grandmother had always believed that the old stories held truth. Somewhere in the blood of every human being was a spark that had been kindled by beings who saw the future of the universe in a species of primitive dreamers huddled around fires And now that spark was needed again. What do we do? She asked. The keeper took her hands, and her grip was warm despite the eons she had spent in the darkness. You go back to your people, she said. You tell them what you have learned, and you prepare them for what is coming. Because the silence is not content to wait any longer. It has already sent something to find you, as if in answer to her words. The ancient vessel shuddered, and alarms began to sound throughout its corridors. A transmission burst through every communication system. And the voice that spoke was made of millions of smaller voices crying out in perfect unison. We have found you, the silence announced. And we remember the taste of dreamer minds. Come home to us, children. Come home to the silence. Una spoke into the darkness for 7 minutes. And the universe listened in terrified silence. She told the voice in the rift about Earth, about humanity's journey to the stars, about the centuries of struggle and wonder that had brought her species to this moment at the edge of nothing. She spoke in the old tongue her grandmother had preserved, and her words carried across the void like prayers that had finally found the ears they were meant for. When she finished, the response came immediately. The door remembers those who built it, the voice said. And this time, the transmission carried something more than words. Coordinates appeared on every screen in the station, marking a point at the exact center of the lightless rift. And beside them glowed a symbol that made Una's heart ache with recognition. It was a pattern she had seen carved into stone at ancient burial sites across Korea. A spiral within a circle within a triangle. A mark that her grandmother had called the sign of the sky ancestors. What is that symbol? Demanded Vareth Cole, who had entered the communication room with 6 armed guards at his back. It is a human symbol, Una replied without looking away from the screen. My ancestors carved it into their tombs 3,000 years ago, and they believed it would guide their spirits home to the stars. The Valarith commander's scales flashed with colors. She had learned to interpret as confusion and something close to fear. That is impossible, he said. But his voice lacked the certainty it had carried before. The Coalition has charted the development of every spacefaring species in this region of the galaxy. And humans did not exist 3,000 years ago, in any form that could have reached this place. Perhaps your charts are incomplete, Una suggested quietly before Vareth Cole could respond. The main sensor array detected something that silenced every argument in the room. The structure at the heart of the rift was moving. It unfolded like a flower made of light and impossible geometry. Petals of energy spreading across millions of kilometers as systems that had slept for eons stirred back to life. And at the center of the awakening structure, sensors detected a vessel. The ship was small compared to the architecture surrounding it. Perhaps twice the size of Threshold Prime. But its design matched nothing in the Coalition database. Its hull curved in ways that suggested organic growth rather than mechanical construction. And its surface was covered with markings that the computer struggled to classify. Una saw the markings clearly when the enhanced image appeared on screen, and she had to grab the console to keep from falling. They were cave paintings, not copies or imitations, but actual cave paintings preserved somehow across billions of years, depicting hunts and dances and ceremonies that belonged to a time before human beings had even developed language. Dr. Xiao, Vareth Cole said slowly. Explain what we are seeing. I cannot, she admitted, because what we are seeing should not exist. The voice from the rift spoke again, and this time it addressed Una directly by a name she had never heard before. Daughter of the Dreamers, it called her. You have found your way home at last, and the Keeper rejoices to see the children grown so tall. Una felt tears streaming down her face. Though she did not understand why. Who are you? She asked in the ancient tongue. Who are the Dreamers, and why do you call us your children? Come to me, the voice replied. Bring witnesses from the young races who have forgotten their origins. and I will show you the truth that was hidden before the first stars of this galaxy were born. Coalition High Command debated for 3 days before authorizing an expedition into the Rift Una. Spent those days studying the impossible vessel and the architecture surrounding it. And the more she learned, the less she understood the structure was old beyond comprehension. Built more than 3 billion years before the present day. Constructed by a civilization that the Coalition's most advanced, historical models could not account for. Nothing should have survived that long. Not in the hostile environment of space. Not in the absolute darkness of the Varentis expanse. Yet the structure had not merely survived, it had been maintained. Someone or something had kept the ancient technology functioning across eons, waiting for a signal that had finally arrived. The expedition team was assembled from representatives of 5 Coalition species. But Una was the only human permitted to join. Vareth Cole commanded the mission despite his obvious discomfort with what they had discovered. And beside him stood Marth Ven, the Cathari engineer who had dismissed Una's concerns as imagination. A high, Malavan security officer named Thresh accompanied them for protection. Her massive frame barely fitting through the shuttle's corridors, 2 Valorith historians completed the team. Their silver scales and ancient eyes serving as witnesses for a species that prided itself on recording every significant moment in galactic history. They entered the rift on the 4th day, and the darkness swallowed them completely. For 6 hours they traveled through nothing, their sensors unable to detect anything beyond their own hull. Their navigation systems relying entirely on the coordinates the voice had provided. Then they emerged into light. The interior of the structure blazed with energy that hurt to look upon directly, and Una shielded her eyes as the shuttle passed through what felt like the membrane of a living cell. When she opened her eyes again, she saw something that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The vessel from the sensor images floated before them, and it was beautiful in ways that human language could not describe. Its hull pulsed with soft golden light, and the cave paintings on its surface seemed to move, depicting scenes of hunting and gathering and celebration that shifted like memories rather than static images. But what made Una weep was the door that opened in the vessel's side, standing. In that doorway was a figure that could only be human. A woman with dark hair and dark eyes and skin the color of rich earth. She wore clothing that belonged to no era Una could identify. Flowing garments that seemed woven from starlight itself, and when she spoke, her voice was the voice from the darkness. The voice that had asked how long it had been. "Welcome home, daughter of the dreamers," the woman said in the ancient tongue. "I am the keeper, and I have waited 3 billion years to see what my children have become." The shuttle docked with the ancient vessel, and the expedition team stepped into a history they had never imagined. The keeper led them through corridors that responded to human presence. Lights flickering on as Una passed and remaining dark for her alien companions, she explained as they walked. And her words rewrote everything the galaxy believed about itself. "We were taken from our world when it was young," the keeper said, "before your ancestors learned to speak, before they learned to dream. A species called the Architects walked among the stars and seeded life across the universe. The Architects recognized something unique in the creatures that would become human," she continued. "A capacity for imagination and adaptation that surpassed their own designs. A spark of creativity that burned brighter than any they had encountered in all their travels. They took samples from our world and elevated them, gave them knowledge and purpose and the gift of endless life. We became the keepers, guardians placed at critical points across the cosmos, sleeping until the day our descendants evolved enough to find us." Vareth Cole's scales had gone pale, and his voice shook when he spoke. "This cannot be true," he insisted. "The Valorith have studied the origins of every spacefaring species, and humans are newcomers, children who stumbled into the stars by accident." The keeper smiled. And her smile held 3 billion years of patience. "Your species did not exist when I was placed here," she said gently. "None of the coalition races did? Because they all evolved from seeds the architects planted long after humanity was chosen. You are not our elders," she continued, looking at each alien in turn. "You are our younger siblings. And you have forgotten the parents we all share." The historians recorded everything with trembling hands, and Yuna felt the universe shifting beneath her feet. But the Keeper's next words turned wonder into terror. "I was not placed here only to greet you," she said, and her ancient eyes filled with sorrow. "I was placed here to warn you. The architects did not disappear peacefully, and the threat that consumed them still sleeps in the spaces between galaxies. And 3 of the rifts that held my siblings have already been opened by something that should never have awakened." Yuna looked at the star map that appeared on the walls around them, showing hundreds of points scattered across the universe. 3 of them pulsed with angry red light. "What opened them?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The Keeper looked at her with eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall like waves on a shore. "Something hungry," she replied. "Something patient, and something that remembers the taste of architect minds. It is called the Silence, and it has been dreaming of your return for 3 billion years." The research station Threshold Prime floated at the edge of nothing, and Dr. Yuna Seong had never seen darkness so complete. She pressed her hand against the observation window and stared into the Varentis expanse, a region of space where no stars had formed for 3 billion years, where light itself seemed afraid to travel, where the elder species of the Galactic Coalition had forbidden exploration since before humanity learned to make fire, that the Coalition's archaeologists had found something impossible in the heart of that darkness. And now 12 scientists from 6 different worlds prepared to make first contact with whatever waited inside. "The probe is ready," announced Vareth Cole, the Valorith mission commander, his silver scales catching the dim light of the command center. "We will broadcast greetings in 847 known languages and await response." Yuna watched the massive alien move through the room with the confidence of a species that had charted the galaxy for 3 million years, and she felt the familiar sting of being the youngest civilization at the table. Humans had achieved faster than light travel only 3 centuries ago, and most coalition species still treated them like children playing with dangerous tools. Dr. Seong called Vareth Cole without turning around. "You seem distracted. The sensor readings are strange," she replied, pulling up her datapad. "The structure at the center of the rift is generating energy patterns I cannot identify, but they pulse in sequences of 7. 7 is common in crystalline formations," said Morthven, the Cathari engineer, waving one of her 4 arms dismissively. "It means nothing. 7 is also sacred in early human mathematics and religion," Yuna said quietly. Many Earth cultures built their calendars around it. The room went silent for a moment, and she felt the weight of alien eyes judging her words. "You see human patterns everywhere," Vareth Cole said with what might have been patience or might have been pity. "The universe does not revolve around your young species." "Dr. Seong." Yuna lowered her head and said nothing more, but she saved the readings to her personal files and continued watching the data stream. The probe launched an hour later, a silver needle carrying the hopes of 100 civilizations into the deepest darkness the galaxy had ever known. For 17 hours, nothing happened. Scientists slept in shifts, while automated systems monitored every frequency, every wavelength, every possible method of communication that the Coalition had ever discovered. Yuna stayed awake through all of it, drinking cold coffee and studying the strange energy pulses that nobody else seemed to care about. She was alone in the secondary monitoring station when the response came. Every screen in the room lit up at once. and every speaker crackled with static that slowly resolved into something that made her heart stop beating. A voice spoke from the darkness, and it spoke in Korean. How long has it been? Yuna's coffee cup shattered on the floor, but she did not hear it fall. The voice was old, older than anything she had ever heard, but the words were unmistakable, and the accent carried patterns that she recognized from historical linguistics courses she had taken as a student. This was not modern Korean, not the language her grandmother had taught her as a child. This was something ancient, something that had not been spoken on Earth for nearly 2,000 years. Station alert, announced the computer system. Unidentified transmission received from within the lightless rift. Language analysis indicates unknown origin. Unknown origin. Yuna thought as alarms began blaring throughout Threshold Prime. Because the computer had never been programmed to recognize a dead Earth language, she ran to the command center and found chaos waiting for her. Vareth Cole stood at the central console, his scales flashing colors she had never seen before, while scientists from every species shouted theories and accusations across the room. "This is impossible," declared the Malavan security chief, her massive form blocking the main display. "Humans have only traveled the stars for 3 centuries. They cannot have reached the rift before us. It must be a translation error," insisted Morthven. "The universal greeting protocol may have triggered some kind of echo response." "It is not an error," Yuna said, and her voice cut through the noise like a blade. "The transmission is in Old Korean, a language that died on Earth approximately 1,700 years before we achieved spaceflight." Every alien in the room turned to stare at her. "You are certain?" Vareth Cole asked slowly. "I am certain," she replied. "My grandmother was a historical linguist, and she taught me to recognize the patterns of our ancestral tongues. But this dialect has not been spoken by any living human for nearly 2 millennia. The command center fell silent, and Yuna could hear the hum of the station's life. Support systems struggling against the cold emptiness outside. "Then what is speaking from the rift?" asked Morthven in a voice that trembled despite her species. "Reputation for emotional control." Yuna looked at the main display, where the structure at the heart of the darkness had begun to glow with soft golden light, and she felt something ancient stirring in her blood. "I do not know," she admitted, "but I believe it has been waiting for us to ask." Coalition High Command was contacted within the hour, and within 6 hours, a fleet of diplomatic vessels had arrived at Threshold Prime. Yuna found herself confined to her quarters, while admirals and ambassadors argued about what to do with the impossible transmission. And she spent the time studying every scrap of data she could access. The energy pulses from the structure had changed after the transmission, and now they matched the rhythm of a human heartbeat almost perfectly. She was reviewing the linguistic analysis for the 100th time when she noticed something that made her forget to breathe. The voice had asked its question with an accent pattern that existed only in one small region of ancient Korea, a pattern that historians believed had disappeared during the 3 Kingdoms period, but the mathematical structure hidden in the transmission's carrier wave used counting systems that predated human civilization entirely. Someone or something had learned an ancient Earth language and preserved it perfectly for thousands of years. And they had done so using technology that should not exist. Yuna pulled up every historical database she could access and began cross-referencing the accent patterns with archaeological records. 3 hours later, she found what she was looking for. The accent matched samples recovered from burial sites in the Gaia Confederacy, a kingdom that had flourished on the Korean peninsula between the 1st and 6th centuries, a culture known for its iron craftsmanship and its mysterious connections to forces that its neighbors did not understand. The Gaia had believed that their ancestors came from the sky, and they had built tombs aligned with stars that modern astronomers had only recently Learned to name Yuna stared at her findings and felt the weight of something enormous pressing down on her understanding of the universe outside her window. The lightless rift waited with infinite patience, and somewhere in that darkness, a voice that should not exist was waiting for her to answer. She opened the communication channel to the command center and spoke before anyone could stop her. "This is Dr. Yuna Seong," she said clearly. "I am requesting permission to respond to the transmission, because I believe I am the only person on this station who speaks the language of whoever is waiting for us." The channel remained silent for a long moment. Then Verith, Cole's voice, replied with words that would change the history of the galaxy forever. "Permission granted, Dr. Seong. But understand that whatever happens next will be your responsibility alone." Yuna closed her eyes and thought of her grandmother, who had always believed that the old stories held more truth than anyone realized. Then she opened the transmission channel and began to speak in a language that had been dead for 2,000 years. And in the heart of the lightless rift, something ancient began to wake.